Friedrich Engels, The Principles of Communism. Question 1. What is communism? Answer. Communism is the doctrine of the conditions for the liberation of the proletariat. Question 2. What is the proletariat? Answer. A proletariat is a social class that earns its livelihood solely by selling its labor and does not live off the profits of any capital. A class, happiness, sorrow, life and death, whose entire existence depends on the demand for labor. That is, from the alternation of good and bad conditions, from fluctuations, unrestrained competition. In a word, the proletariat or the proletarian class is the working class of the 19th century. Question 3. So the proletarians didn't always exist? Answer. No, not always. The poor working classes have always existed, and usually the working classes were in poverty. But such poor people, such workers who would live in the conditions just mentioned, that is, the proletarians, did not always exist, just as competition was not always completely free and unrestricted. Question 4. How did the proletariat arise? Answer. The proletariat arose as a result of the Industrial Revolution that took place in England in the second half of the last century, and has since been repeated in all civilized countries of the world. This Industrial Revolution was triggered by the invention of the steam engine, various limit machines, the mechanical loom, and a variety of other mechanical devices. These machines, which were very expensive and therefore accessible only to large capitalists, changed the entire mode of production that had existed up to then and displaced the former workers, because the machines produced goods cheaper and better than the workers could make them with their imperfect spinning wheels and looms. In this way, these machines placed industry entirely in the hands of the big capitalists and completely devalued the insignificant property that belonged to the workers, tools, looms, and so on. So the capitalists soon took everything into their own hands, and the workers had nothing left. Thus, a factory system was introduced in the field of fabric production. As soon as the impetus was given to the introduction of the machine factory system, the latter quickly spread to all other industries, especially in the field of fabric stuffing, printing, pottery, and the manufacture of metal products. Labor began to be more and more divided among individual workers. So the worker who used to do all the work in its entirety now began to do only part of it. This division of labor made it possible to produce products faster and therefore cheaper. It reduced the activity of each worker to some very simple, constantly repeating mechanical technique, which could be performed by a machine with the same success and even much better. In this way, all branches of industry, one after another, fell under the rule of steam machines and the factory system, just as it was in the case in marginal and weaving production. But by doing so, they completely passed into the hands of the big capitalists, and the workers were also deprived of the last remnants of their independence. Gradually, the factory system extended its dominance not only to manufacture in the proper sense of the word, but also began to take over handicrafts more and more, as in this area the large capitalists increasingly displaced small craftsmen by setting up large workshops in which it was possible to achieve savings on many expenses, and also introduce a detailed division of labor. As a result, we have now come to the conclusion that factory production has been established in almost all branches of labor in civilized countries, and in almost all of these branches, handicrafts and manufacture have been replaced by large industry. As a result, the former middle class, especially the small artisans, is becoming more and more ruined. The former position of the worker is completely changing, and two new classes are being created, which gradually absorb all the others. Namely, the first, the class of large capitalists, who in all civilized countries are already almost the sole owners of all the means of subsistence, as well as the raw materials and tools, machines, factories, and the like necessary for their production. This is the bourgeois class or the bourgeoisie. Second, a class of the completely poor, who as a result are forced to sell their labor to the bourgeoisie to receive in return the means of subsistence necessary for their existence.
This class is called the proletarian class or the proletariat. Question 5. Under what conditions is this sale of the labor of the bourgeoisie proletarians carried out? Answer. Labor is the same commodity as any other commodity, and its price is determined by the same laws as the price of any other commodity. Under the rule of large-scale industry or free competition, which we will see later are the same thing, the price of a commodity on average always equals the cost of production of that commodity. Consequently, the price of labor is also equal to the cost of producing labor, and the cost of producing labor consists precisely of the amount of living resources necessary for the worker to be able to maintain his ability to work and for the working class not to die out. The worker will not receive more than is necessary for this purpose. The price of labor or wages will therefore be the lowest and will be the minimum necessary to support life. But since there are better and worse times in business, the worker will receive more and less, just as the manufacturer receives more and less for his goods. And just as the manufacturer, on average, if we take good and bad times, still receives for his goods no more and no less than the cost of production, so the worker, on average, receives no more and no less than this minimum. This economic law of wages will be implemented the more strictly, the more large-scale industry will master all branches of labor. Question 6. What working classes existed before the Industrial Revolution? Answer. The working classes, depending on the different stages of social development, lived in different conditions and occupied different positions in relation to the propertied and ruling classes. In ancient times, the workers were slaves to their masters, as they are still slaves today in many backward countries and even in the southern United States. In the Middle Ages, they were serfs of noble landowners, which they remain to this day in Hungary, Poland, and Russia. In addition, in the cities in the Middle Ages, until the Industrial Revolution, there were artisan apprentices who worked for petty bourgeois masters, and with the development of manufacture workers gradually began to appear who were now hired by larger capitalists.
Question 7. What is the difference between a proletarian and a slave? Answer. The slave is sold once and for all. The proletarian must sell himself daily and hourly. Each individual slave is the property of a certain master, and as a result of the latter's interest, the slave's existence is ensured, no matter how pathetic it may be. The individual proletarian is, so to speak, the property of the entire bourgeois class. His labor is bought only when someone needs it, and therefore his existence is not assured. This existence is guaranteed only to the proletarian class as a whole. A slave stands outside competition. The proletarian stands in competition. A slave is considered a thing, not a member of civil society. The proletarian is recognized as a person, a member of civil society. Consequently, a slave may have a more tolerable existence than a proletarian, but the proletarian belongs to a society at a higher stage of development, and he himself stands at a higher stage than a slave. A slave emancipates himself by destroying only one relation of slavery out of all the relations of private property, and thereby only becomes a proletarian. The proletarian can liberate himself only by destroying private property in general. The 8th question. What is the difference between a proletarian and a serf? Answer. A serf owns and uses an instrument of production, a piece of land, and for this he gives away part of his income or performs a number of jobs. The proletarian, on the other hand, works with the instruments of production belonging to another and performs work for the benefit of this other, receiving in return a portion of the income. The serf gives, they give to the proletariat. The existence of the serf is assured, the existence of the proletarian is not. The serf stands outside competition, the proletarian stands in competition. A serf frees himself either by running away to the city and becoming an artisan there, or by delivering money to his landowner instead of work or food, becoming a free tenant,
or by driving away his feudal lord, becoming an owner himself. In short, he liberates himself by somehow joining the ranks of the property-owning class and entering the sphere of competition. The proletarian liberates himself by destroying competition, private property, and all class distinctions. Question 9. What is the difference between a proletarian and a craftsman? Further, Engels has a gap in the manuscript, which he left to answer the 9th question. Question 10. What is the difference between a proletarian and a manufacture worker? The manufacture worker of the 16th and 18th centuries almost everywhere also owned the tools of production, his loom, a spinning wheel for his family, and a small plot of land that he cultivated in his spare hours. The proletarian has none of this. The manufacture worker almost always lives in the country and is in a more or less patriarchal relationship with his landowner or employer. The proletarian mostly lives in big cities and has a purely monetary relationship with his employer. Large industry tears the manufacture worker out of his patriarchal conditions. He loses the last property he still possessed, and only then does this transform him into a proletarian. Question 11. What were the immediate consequences of the Industrial Revolution and the division of society into bourgeois and proletarians? Firstly, due to the fact that machine labor increasingly lowered the prices of industrial products, in all countries of the world, the former system of manufacture or industry based on hand labor was completely destroyed. All the semi-barbaric countries that hitherto remained more or less alien to historical development, and whose industry had hitherto remained on manufacture, were forcibly torn from their state of isolation. They began to buy cheaper goods from the British and doomed their own manufacture workers. Thus, countries that have not seen progress for thousands of years, such as China, have undergone a complete revolution, and even China is currently heading towards revolution. It got to the point that the new machine that is being invented in England today deprives millions of workers in China of bread in 1 year. Thus, large industry has connected all the peoples of the earth, united all the small local markets into a world market, prepared the ground for civilization and progress everywhere, and led to the fact that everything that happens in civilized countries should have an impact on all the other countries. So if the workers in England or France are now emancipating themselves, then in all the other countries this should trigger revolutions, which sooner or later will also lead to the emancipation of the workers there. Secondly, wherever large industry replaced manufacture, the Industrial Revolution enormously increased the wealth and power of the bourgeoisie and made it the first class in the country. The result of this was that wherever such a process took place, the bourgeoisie gained political power and displaced the classes that had previously dominated, the aristocracy, the guild burghers, and representing both, the absolute monarchy. The bourgeoisie destroyed the power of the aristocracy, the nobility, by abolishing the entail or inalienable right to land and abolishing all noble privileges.
She crushed the power of the guild burghers, abolishing all guilds and all the privileges of artisans. In place of both, she put free competition, that is, a state of society in which everyone has the right to engage in any branch of industrial activity, and nothing can prevent him from doing so except the lack of the necessary capital for this. The introduction of free competition is thus tantamount to an open statement that from now on, the members of society are not equal to each other only insofar as their capitals are not equal. That capital becomes the decisive force, and bourgeois capitalists thereby become the first class in society. But free competition is necessary for the initial period of the development of large-scale industry because it represents the only state of society in which large-scale industry can grow. By thus destroying the social power of the nobility and the guildsburghers, the bourgeoisie also destroyed their political power. Having become the first class in society, she proclaimed herself the first class in the political field. She did this by introducing a representative system based on bourgeois equality before the law and the legislative recognition of free competition. This system was introduced in European countries in the form of a constitutional monarchy.
In constitutional monarchies, the rights of voters are enjoyed only by those who have a certain amount of capital, that is, only by the bourgeoisie. These bourgeois voters elect deputies, and these bourgeois deputies, using the right to refuse taxes, elect a bourgeois government. Thirdly, the Industrial Revolution everywhere contributed to the development of the proletariat as much as to the development of the bourgeoisie. The richer the bourgeoisie became, the more numerous the proletarians became. Since only capital can provide work for the proletarians, and capital increases only when it employs labor, the growth of the proletariat occurs in exact accordance with the growth of capital. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution gathers the bourgeoisie and the proletariat into big cities where it is most profitable to develop industry, and by gathering huge masses in one place, inspires the proletarians with a consciousness of their strength. Then, as the Industrial Revolution develops, as new machines are further invented to replace manual labor, large-scale industry puts increasing pressure on wages and reduces them, as we have already said, to a minimum, as a result of which the situation of the proletariat becomes more and more unbearable. Thus, on the one hand, as a result of the growing discontent of the proletariat, and on the other, as a result of the growth of its power, the Industrial Revolution prepares the social revolution that the proletariat will produce. Question 12. What were the further consequences of the Industrial Revolution? Answer. Large-scale industry has created, in the form of steam and other machines, the means to increase industrial production indefinitely in a short time and at low cost. Due to this ease of expansion of production, free competition, which is a necessary consequence of this large-scale industry, soon became extremely acute. The mass of capitalists rushed into industry, and very soon more was produced than could be consumed. As a result, the manufactured goods could not be sold, and the trade crisis ensued. The factories had to stop, the manufacturers went bankrupt, and the workers lost their bread, and there was terrible poverty everywhere. After some time, the excess products were sold, the factories started working again, wages rose, and gradually things went better than ever, but not for long, because soon too many goods were produced again, and a new crisis began, proceeding exactly as the previous one. Thus, since the beginning of this century, the industrial situation has constantly been fluctuating between periods of prosperity and periods of crisis, and almost regularly every 5 or 7 years such a crisis has occurred, and each time it has caused the greatest disasters among the workers, general revolutionary excitement, and the greatest danger for the entire existing system. The question 13. What follows from these recurring trade crises? Answer. First, that although large-scale industry itself created free competition in the first epoch of its development, it has now outgrown free competition, that competition and in general the conduct of industrial production by individuals have become fetters for large-scale industry, which it must and will break. That large-scale industry, while it is being conducted in current conditions, it cannot exist without leading to a general disorder which repeats every 7 years, and each time this puts the entire civilization in danger, and not only throws the proletarians to the bottom of poverty, but also ruins many bourgeoisie, which means that it is necessary either to abandon large-scale industry, which is absolutely impossible, or to recognize that it makes it absolutely necessary to create an entirely new social order in which the management of industrial production is carried out not by individual competing manufacturers, but by the whole society according to a firm plan and accordingly the needs of all members of society. Secondly, that large-scale industry and the resulting possibility of endless expansion of production make it possible to create a social system in which so many of the necessities of life will be produced that every member of society will be able to freely develop and apply all their strengths and abilities. So it is precisely this property of large-scale industry which in modern society generates all poverty and all trade crises that will appear in another social organization as precisely this property that will destroy this poverty and these calamitous fluctuations. Thus, it has been quite convincingly proven, firstly, that at present all these disasters are explained only by the social system which no longer corresponds to the conditions of the time. Secondly, the means are already available to finally eliminate these disasters by creating a new social order. The 14th question. What should this new social order look like? Answer. First of all, the management of industry and all branches of production in general will be taken out of the hands of individual competing individuals. Instead, all branches of production will be under the jurisdiction of the whole society, that is, they will be conducted in the public interest, according to a public plan and with the participation of all members of society. Thus, this new social order will destroy competition and put association in its place. Since the conduct of industry by individuals has as necessary consequence private property, and since competition is nothing more than a way of conducting industry when it is managed by individual private owners, private property is inseparable from the individual conduct of industry and from competition. Consequently, private property must also be eliminated, and its place will be taken by the common use of all instruments of production and the distribution of products by common agreement or the so-called community of property. The abolition of private property is even the briefest and most generalized expression of the transformation of the whole social system that has become necessary as a result of the development of industry. Therefore, the Communists quite correctly put forward the destruction of private property as their main demand. The 15th question. So the destruction of private property was previously impossible? Yes, it is impossible. Every change in the social system, every revolution in property relations, was a necessary consequence of the creation of new productive forces which ceased to correspond to the old property relations. This is how private property itself arose. The fact is that private property has not always existed. When, at the end of the Middle Ages, a new mode of production arose in the form of manufacture which did not fit into the framework of the then feudal property, this manufacture, which had already outgrown the old property relations, created for itself a new form of ownership, private property. For manufacture and for the first stage of the development of large-scale industry, no other form of ownership was possible except private property. No other social order was possible except one based on private property. Until it is impossible to produce on such a scale that there is not only enough for everyone, but that there is still an excess of products to increase social capital and further develop the productive forces, until then there must always remain the ruling class which controls the productive forces of society, and another class, the poor and oppressed. What are these classes? It depends on the stage of production. In the Middle Ages, we have a landowner and a serf. In the cities of the late Middle Ages, a guildmaster, an apprentice, and a day laborer. In the 17th century, the owner of a manufacture and a factory worker. In the 19th century, a large manufacturer and a proletarian. It is quite obvious that up to the present time, the productive forces have not yet been developed to such an extent that it is possible to produce a sufficient number of products for everyone, and that private property has already become a fetter, an obstacle to the development of these productive forces. But now, thanks to the development of large-scale industry, firstly, the capitals and productive forces created to a previously unheard-of extent have the means to increase these productive forces indefinitely in a short time and at low cost. Secondly, these productive forces are concentrated in the hands of a few bourgeoisie, while the broad masses of the people are increasingly turning into proletarians, and their situation becomes more and more miserable and unbearable the more the wealth of the bourgeoisie increases. Thirdly, these powerful, easily magnified productive forces have outgrown private property and the bourgeoisie to such an extent that they continuously cause severe upheavals of the social system. Therefore, it is only now that the destruction of private property has become not only possible, but absolutely necessary.
The 16th question. Is it possible to destroy private property peacefully? Answer. One could wish that it were so. And the communists, of course, would be the last to object to it. The communists know very well that all kinds of conspiracies are not only useless, but even harmful. They know very well that revolutions cannot be made intentionally or arbitrarily, and that revolutions have always and everywhere been the necessary consequence of circumstances that were completely independent of the will and leadership of individual parties and entire classes. But at the same time, they see that the development of the proletariat in almost all civilized countries is being forcibly suppressed, and thus the opponents of the communists are working with all their might for the revolution.
If all this eventually pushes the oppressed proletariat to revolution, then we communists will defend the cause of the proletariat with action no worse than we are now with words. The 17th question. Is it possible to destroy private property right away? Answer. No, it's impossible. Just as it is impossible to immediately increase the available productive forces within such limits as are necessary to create a social economy. Therefore, the impending revolution of the proletariat can only gradually transform the current society and only then destroy private property when the necessary mass of means of production is created. Question 18. What will be the course of this revolution? Answer. First of all, it will create a democratic system and thereby, directly or indirectly, the political rule of the proletariat. Right in England, where the proletarians are already the majority of the people, indirectly in France and Germany, where the majority of the people consists not only of proletarians, but also of small peasants and urban petty bourgeoisie who are still only at the stage of transition to the proletariat. In the realization of all their political interests, they are increasingly dependent on the proletariat, and therefore they will soon have to join their demands. For this, perhaps, a new struggle will be needed, which, however, will certainly end with the victory of the proletariat. Democracy would be completely useless for the proletariat if it were not immediately used as a means to carry out broad measures that directly encroach on private property and ensure the existence of the proletariat. These most important measures, which necessarily follow from the existing conditions, are as follows. 1. Restriction of private property, progressive tax, high inheritance tax, abolition of inheritance in the sidelines of brothers, nephews, etc., forced loans. 2. Gradual expropriation of landowners, manufacturers, railway owners, and ship owners, partly through competition from state industry, partly directly through the purchase of banknotes. 3. Confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels who rebelled against the majority of the people. 4. The organization of labor or the provision of employment for the proletariat on national estates, factories, and workshops, thereby eliminating the competition of workers among themselves, and the manufacturers, since they still remain, will be forced to pay the same high wages as the state. 5. Equal obligation to work for all members of society until the complete destruction of private property, the formation of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 6. Centralization of the credit system and money trading in the hands of the state, through a national bank with state capital, the closing of all private banks and banking offices. 7. An increase in the number of national factories, workshops, railways, ships, the cultivation of all lands that remain uncultivated, and the improvement of the cultivation of already cultivated lands according to the increase in capital and the increase in the number of workers available to the nation. 8. Education of all children from the moment they can do without maternal care in state institutions and at the state expense, combining education with factory labor. 9. The construction of large palaces in national possessions as common dwellings for commune citizens who will engage in industry, agriculture, and combine the advantages of urban and rural lifestyles without suffering from their one-sidedness and disadvantages. 10. The destruction of all unhealthy and poorly built houses and neighborhoods in cities. 11. Equal inheritance rights for married and illegitimate children. 12. The concentration of the entire transportation business in the hands of the nation. Of course, all these events cannot be held in one session, but one of them will lead to the other. It is only necessary to launch the first radical attack on private property, and the proletariat will be forced to go further and further, to concentrate more and more in the hands of the state all capital, all agriculture, all industry, all transport, and all exchange. All the listed events lead to this. The feasibility of these measures and the centralization they generate will increase to the exact same extent as the productive forces of the country will be multiplied by the labor of the proletariat. Finally, when all capital, all production, and all exchange are concentrated in the hands of the nation, then private property will disappear by itself, money will become superfluous, and production will increase to such an extent that people will change so much that the last forms of relations of the old society will be able to disappear. The 19th question. Can this revolution happen in any one country? The answer is no. Large-scale industry, by the very fact that it has created a world market, has so interconnected all the peoples of the globe, especially civilized peoples, that each of them depends on what is happening to the other. Then, large-scale industry so equalized social development in all civilized countries that everywhere the bourgeoisie and the proletarian became the two decisive classes of society, and the struggle between them is the main struggle of our time. Therefore, the communist revolution will not be national, but will take place simultaneously in all civilized countries, that is, at least in England, America, France, and Germany. In each of these countries, it will develop faster or slower depending on which of these countries has the most developed industry, most accumulated wealth, and the most significant number of productive forces. Thus, it will be carried out the slowest and most difficult in Germany, the fastest and easiest in England. It will also have a significant impact on the rest of the world and will completely change and enormously accelerate their previous course of development. It is a worldwide revolution, and therefore will have a worldwide arena. But judging from Leninism, the revolution happened in Russia, which proved the opposite. Namely, revolution may not necessarily happen in industrial countries, but also in backward, predominantly peasant ones. The 20th question. What will be the consequences of the final elimination of private property? Answer. By taking the use of all productive forces and means of communication out of the hands of private capitalists, as well as the exchange and distribution of products, and by managing this all according to a plan based on the available resources and needs of society as a whole, all the harmful consequences associated with the current system of large-scale industry will be eliminated. Crises will stop. Expanded production, which under the existing social system causes overproduction and is such a powerful cause of poverty, will then prove to be far from insufficient and will have to take on much broader dimensions. An excess of production exceeding the immediate needs of society, instead of generating poverty, will ensure that the needs of all members of society are met, create new needs, and at the same time create the means to meet them. It will be a condition and stimulus for further progress, and will carry out this progress without, as before, disrupting the entire social order. Large-scale industry, freed from the shackles of private property, will develop to such an extent that its current state will seem as insignificant as manufacture appears to us in comparison with the large-scale industry of our time. This industrial development will provide society with enough products to meet the needs of all its members. In the same way, agriculture, for which, due to the oppression of private property and fragmentation of land, it is difficult to introduce existing improvements and scientific achievements, will also enter a completely new period of prosperity and provide society with a completely sufficient number of products. In this way, the society will produce enough products in order to organize a distribution designed to meet the needs of all its members. This will make it unnecessary to divide society into various classes hostile to each other. But not only this, it will even be incompatible with the new social order. The existence of classes is caused by the division of labor, and the division of labor in its present form will completely disappear. Since mechanical and chemical auxiliaries are not enough to raise industrial and economic production to the specified height, it is also necessary to develop accordingly the abilities of people who set these means in motion. Just as in the last century, peasants and factory workers, after being involved in large-scale industry, changed their entire way of life and became completely different people themselves, so the general conduct of production by the forces of all society and the resulting new development of this production will need and create completely new people. Social management of production cannot be carried out by people like they are now, people who each of them is subordinate to one particular branch of production, chained to it, exploited by it, develops only one side of their abilities at the expense of all others, and knows only one branch or one part of any branch of the entire production. The current industry is already less able to employ such people. Industry which is conducted jointly and systematically by the whole society all the more assumes people with comprehensively developed abilities, people who are able to navigate the entire production system. Therefore, the division of labor, which has already been undermined by the machine, which turns one into a peasant, another into a shoemaker, a third into a factory worker, and a fourth into a profiteer, will disappear completely.
Education will give young people the opportunity to quickly master the entire production system in practice. It will allow them to move from one branch of production to another in turn, depending on the needs of society or on their own inclinations. Education will therefore free them from the one-sidedness that the modern division of labor imposes on each individual. Thus, a society organized on a communist basis will enable its members to make full use of their fully developed abilities. But at the same time, the various classes will inevitably disappear. Therefore, on the one hand, a society organized on communist principles is incompatible with the continued existence of classes, and on the other hand, the very construction of this society provides the means to eliminate class differences. It follows that the antithesis between the city and the countryside will also disappear. The same people will be engaged in agriculture and industrial labor instead of leaving it to two different classes. This is a necessary condition for a communist association for very material reasons. The dispersion of the agricultural population in the villages along with the accumulation of the industrial population in large cities only corresponds to an insufficiently high level of development of agriculture and industry, and is an obstacle to any further development which is already making itself felt strongly. The general association of all members of society for the purpose of joint and systematic exploitation of the productive forces, the development of production to such an extent that it satisfies the needs of all, the elimination of the situation when the needs of some people are satisfied at the expense of others, the complete elimination of classes and opposites between them, the comprehensive development of the abilities of all members of society by the elimination of the former division of labor, industrial education, change of occupation, participation of all in the enjoyment of the benefits that are produced by all, and finally, by the merging of the city with the countryside, these are the main results of the liquidation of private property. 21st question. What impact will the communist social order have on the family? Answer. The relationship between the sexes will become an exclusively private matter, which will seem only to interested persons and in which society need not interfere. This is possible due to the elimination of private property and the public education of children, as a result of which both foundations of modern marriage related to private property are destroyed, the dependence of the wife on her husband and the children on their parents. This is the answer to the cries of highly moral Philistines about the communist community of wives. Communal wives are a phenomenon that belongs entirely to bourgeois society and currently exists in full in the form of prostitution. But prostitution is based on private property and will disappear with it. Consequently, the communist organization, instead of introducing a community of wives, on the contrary, will destroy it. 22nd question. How will the communist organization treat the existing nationalities? It remains. In the manuscript, instead of answering the 22nd as well as the subsequent 23rd question, the word remains. Apparently, it means that the answer should remain as it was formulated in one of the preliminary drafts of the program of the Union of Communists that have not reached us. 23rd question. How will it relate to existing religions? It remains.
24th question. What is the difference between communists and socialists? Answer. The so-called socialists fall into three categories. The first category consists of supporters of a feudal and patriarchal society, which has been destroyed and is being destroyed every day by large-scale industry, world trade, and the bourgeois society they created. This category, of disasters of modern society, concludes that it is necessary to restore the feudal and patriarchal society, since it was free from these disasters. All her proposals are directed towards this goal in direct or indirect ways. The communists will always resolutely fight this category of reactionary socialists, despite its alleged sympathy for the poverty of the proletariat and the bitter tears shed on this occasion. For these socialists, first of all, strive for something completely impossible. Secondly, they are trying to restore the rule of the aristocracy, guild masters, and factory owners with their retinue of absolute or feudal monarchs, officials, soldiers, and priests.
They want to rebuild a society which, true, would be free from the vices of modern society, but would bring with it at least as many other disasters, and moreover would not open up any prospects for the liberation of oppressed workers through communist organization. The third, they always reveal their true intentions when the proletariat becomes revolutionary and communist. In these cases, they immediately unite with the bourgeoisie against the proletarians. The second category consists of supporters of the current society, who inevitably fear for its existence due to the disasters generated by this society. They seek, therefore, to preserve the current society, but to eliminate the disasters associated with it. To do this, some propose measures of simple charity, others grandiose reform plans that, under the pretext of reorganizing society, aim to preserve the foundations of the current society and thus the current society itself. The communists will also have to wage a relentless struggle against these bourgeois socialists because their activities benefit the enemies of the communists, and they defend the social order that the communists want to destroy. Finally, the third category consists of democratic socialists. Following the path with the communists, they want to implement part of the measures indicated in the manuscript. The gap refers to the 18th question. In the 18th question, but not as transitional measures leading to communism, but as measures sufficient to eliminate poverty and eliminate the disasters of the current society. These democratic socialists are either proletarians who have not yet sufficiently understood the conditions for the emancipation of their class, or representatives of the petty bourgeoisie, that is, a class that, up to the conquest of democracy and the implementation of socialist measures resulting from it, has in many respects the same interests as the proletarians. Therefore, the communists will enter into agreements with the democratic socialists at the moment of action, and in general, during this time, they should adhere to a common policy with them, if possible, unless these socialists go into the service of the ruling bourgeoisie and attack the communists. Of course, joint action does not exclude discussing the differences that exist between them and the communists. 25th question. What is the relation of the communists to the rest of the political parties of our time? Answer. The relation is different in different countries. In England, France, and Belgium, where the bourgeoisie dominates, the communists still have common interests with various democratic parties. Moreover, this community of interests is all the more significant the more the Democrats approach the goals of the communists in those socialist activities that the Democrats everywhere are now defending. That is, the more clearly and definitely they defend the interests of the proletariat, and the more they rely on the proletariat. In England, for example, the Chartists, consisting of workers, are immeasurably closer to the communists than the democratic petty bourgeoisie or the so-called radicals. In America, where a democratic constitution has been introduced, the communists will have to support the party that wants to turn this constitution against the bourgeoisie and use it in the interests of the proletariat, that is, the party of supporters of national agrarian reform. In Switzerland, the radicals, although they are still a very mixed party, are however the only ones with whom the communists can enter into an agreement, and among these radicals, again, the most progressive are the Paris and Geneva. Finally, in Germany, the decisive struggle between the bourgeoisie and the absolute monarchy is still ahead. But since the communists cannot expect to have to engage in a decisive battle with the bourgeoisie before the bourgeoisie achieves supremacy, it is in the interests of the communists to help the bourgeoisie achieve supremacy as soon as possible, in order to overthrow it as soon as possible. Thus, in the struggle of the liberal bourgeoisie against the governments, the communists must always be on the side of the former, although being wary of the self-deception into which the bourgeoisie falls and not trusting its seductive assurances about the beneficial consequences which the victory of the bourgeoisie will supposedly entail for the proletariat. The only advantages from the victory of the bourgeoisie for the communists will consist in the first of various kinds of concessions which will make it easier for the communists to defend, discuss, and spread their principles, and thus facilitate the unification of the proletariat into a closely knit, ready to fight, and organized class.
and in the second, of the certainty that the day the absolutist governments fall, the time will come for the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletarians. From that day forward, the party policy of the communists will be the same here as in the countries where the bourgeoisie already dominates. Written by Engels at the end of October-November 1847. It was first published in a separate edition in 1914.